All right, well, I'll start with the first one. Tell me about your journey in education and why you wanted to be an educator.
So, my journey in education actually had started as an elementary educator. I guess I should say, I had started on the route to become an elementary educator. I had taken a few extra classes during undergrad to be certified in special education as well as elementary education. And initially, I had really just started off on that route because I felt like it was going to make myself more marketable. I knew that as an elementary educator that I would potentially have students with special needs in my classroom, and I just thought that it would be an important thing to add some extra skills underneath my belt and really be able to nail down that job as an elementary educator that I thought I wanted. And then when I graduated with my bachelor's and both certifications, I actually ended up landing my first job out of school at a middle school in Northeast Philadelphia. And I was teaching special education, seventh and eighth grade math.
Hmm.
And,
Hmm.
if you asked me in college, what are the three things that I don't want to ever teach, it was probably middle school special ed math.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
here I was as a middle school special ed math teacher. However, in that position, I really fell in love with all three of those pieces. I fell in love with teaching students who have exceptionalities. No, no, no issue with general education students. Of course, love them in my co-taught classes and all of that. However, working with kids in special education, I mean, they are just a new day every day and just so
Hmm.
wonderful, just the greatest little humans. Um, and then in terms of special education, I'm sorry, middle school, I also just really loved that I came to realize that it's really just such a pivotal um, age range where you can really help kids make some important life decisions that can send them on one path or another. And I felt like it's also this stage where sometimes kids don't necessarily, like adolescents don't necessarily always feel comfortable speaking to the adults that are active parts of their life, and they might come to you as their teacher and confide in you if you have a good relationship with them, and then you have this awesome responsibility of being that person who can really help keep them on a positive life track.
Hmm.
And then with math, it was one of those things where it was just like, I was so scared of it myself. I was not the strongest math student. And so, especially working with kids in particular who struggled with math, I started to recognize a lot of these different things that I myself, as a student, really had difficulty with. And I felt like I was able to recognize that in the moment a lot quicker and approach the problem from a different angle. So I felt like it sort of, my own experiences and having challenges with math instruction
Hmm.
and learning as a kid really sort of felt like set me up to be the best math educator that I could for students in special education.
Those are three things that are historically hard for a lot of people. Math, middle school, special ed.
Yes, absolutely. No doubt about that.
So um, what do you think you like most about being a special ed teacher?
So, number one, building relationships with students and families. I felt like that was something that was just so incredibly important to everything else. So, like I said, I taught math. That was, and a lot of times I feel like, especially in math and like language arts classes in particular, that tend to have testing every single year, and these massive curricula that you have to get through in order to make sure that your kids are prepared to take those tests at the end of the year, that those teachers who are providing instruction in those content areas tend to be incredibly overwhelmed with content, content, content. And what I really came to find was that building relationships with my students and making sure that their families also know that I'm first and foremost here to support them as people, not just as, math students. I felt like created this space where my students first and foremost felt loved and welcomed and appreciated. And by harboring those feelings, they were less scared to take risks and to try those different math concepts that, maybe they've had a really hard time with in the past, or were just super scared of to even jump into in the first place. I also, this might sound a bit masochistic of me, but I also really enjoyed writing IEPs.
Okay.
IEPs were one of my one of my favorite parts. I always looked at IEPs as an opportunity to tell a kid's story. And again, what an awesome responsibility that is, because of course they get reviewed annually, and of course they're being updated and changed. And whatever you wrote for one student one year might not necessarily be around for much longer into the next year. That being said, in most cases, depending on how it's structured from school to school, that is a document that is following that child. And unlike general education students who every year they get to walk into a classroom with a completely clean slate, and like maybe teachers talk about different students and you hear something about this little kid over here and that girl over there. But aside from that, like special education students, they have this whole document with all of this information that's being carried with them from classroom to classroom. And so there's so much that is automatically being ingrained in people's perceptions of children when it comes to special education students before teachers even get to meet some of these kids in a lot of cases.
True.
And so writing IEPs and making sure that we're writing them in a way that is as objective as possible, sticking to the facts, sticking to the things that work for that kid, as well as the things that don't work for that kid, or from your experience in working with them at least, and making sure that we're telling a positive story, not always focusing on what a kid can't do, and trying to help teachers understand what a kid can do and how we can best support them. So in that sense, I really enjoyed writing IEPs too.
Wow. I like the way that you put that. It's an opportunity for us to portray some of the strengths the student has, an opportunity for us to be objective, because a lot of the things that are sometimes said about students is very subjective. And it's something that follows a student for a long time. So what better place to show that story or tell that story than a IEP?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
Well,
especially at middle school, when kids change, like their whole personalities, in addition to like all of the physiological changes, like their personalities change so rapidly when they're in middle school. And so when I had, I've taught 7th grade for a very long time, and that's like, that right in between, like 6th grade, they're still kind of babies from elementary school and like, starting to come in their own. 7th grade, they're super silly. And then 8th grade, it's like they start to become these little adults. And when I would get a 6th grader's IEP coming into 7th grade, I mean, sometimes what I was seeing in the classroom was completely different than what I was seeing written in this child's
Mhm.
IEP, whether it was, biases from the teachers that whoever the case manager was the year prior, or whether it was, those significant changes had occurred over the summer, which is absolutely possible too. Um, you know, there's no harm in picking up the phone and calling a parent and saying, hey, I'm not necessarily seeing, the things that have been conveyed in this document anymore. Why don't we reconvene as a team and start talking about how we can make sure that this IEP is catered to your child and their needs, and the supports that they require.
So true. So, Lindsay, you're currently a doctoral student at the University of Virginia. I was wondering if you could just tell everyone about your work, what you're doing right now, what are you working on, and some of the things that you're passionate about and you're researching right now.
Sure. So, a lot of my work is centered around, I'll start with the students. I think that's the most important place to begin. Really, just students with intersectional identities, particularly kids with disabilities who also identify with a minoritized racial ethnic background, um, culturally and linguistically diverse students, racially diverse students, so on and so forth. With that, I really try to I think it's important to, and I'm going to give a shout out to Dr. LaRon Scott here. But Dr. LaRon Scott had mentioned this important linkage between policy and practice, right? We don't have practice without policy, and we don't have policy without practice. And with that, I think that, or I guess my hypothesis that I've been developing over the last 3 years is that we really have a breakdown in communication in both of those places.
Mm,
So, a lot of my work is focused on how to support more effective communication within special education policy as well as special education practice.
mm. I'm wondering what are the what kind of systems of oppression do those students face? You mentioned um, students talking about intersectionality, students with multiple identities. What kind of systems of oppression do those students face in schools? And as educators, how do we perpetuate those systems?
That is an excellent question. So, I really think that when we're talking about systems of oppression that are affecting multiply marginalized students in particular, I think racism and ableism, as well as in a lot of cases, sexism, really come into play here. You know, in terms of how those systems get perpetuated, a big part of it is developing and implementing these different policies that use very broad and conflicting language. For
Mm,
example, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and
mhm,
there's lots of broad terms in there. When we think about a free, appropriate public education, um, you know, give you a little bit of context here. I, along my journey in education, I've worked in a lot of different school systems. I've worked in inner cities. I've worked in rural school systems. I've worked in suburban school systems. I've seen quite a gamut of different contexts. And one of the things that has stuck out in my mind is this idea of a free, appropriate public education. And when I think about that word appropriate, I think who is determining what can be deemed appropriate
mm,
and for who are those things
mm,
appropriate.
mm,
Um, when I worked in inner city Philadelphia, what was apparently deemed appropriate for students in the city was vastly different than what was apparently deemed appropriate for the students in the, extremely wealthy suburban school system that I had worked in. And so with that, I know the purpose of developing this policy language is so that we can rally the forces behind it and get these things passed and signed into law and make everybody happy, essentially. But at the same time, when we are authorizing use of such language, we're giving permission to all of the individual school systems to decide, who's going to get what and what's going to be appropriate. And so we really need to be a bit more conscious about that particular piece. In addition to also, I think essentialism is a big piece here. This idea of, oh, well, it works for this group, and so it works for everyone. Maintaining, these mentalities of this is how it's always been, this is how I've always done it, this is what works for all students, when we know that, everybody's individual experience is their own, and we really need to cater our instruction and cater our school policies to individual people.
What ways can we improve outcomes for students with disabilities?
So
I guess let me rephrase that. I want to be more specific. What things can schools, districts, and policymakers do to improve outcomes for students who are racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse?
So I think a big thing here is figuring out ways to gather input from individuals who identify as racially and culturally and linguistically diverse. And I'm talking students, families, the educators who serve these students and families effectively, and having a conversation about it. Like I said, I think that there's a lot that comes down to this idea about communication, right? We are constantly communicating in a variety of different ways, and sometimes we're doing it effectively, but most of the time we're not. And if we're not focusing on who we're speaking to and how we're speaking to them and what is being gleaned from these communicative interactions, then we're missing the point, right? There's so much value in just having a conversation with somebody about, hey, I tried this different instructional practice when we were in math class today. What did you think of it? Was it helpful? Or was it more confusing? Because, even when we think about something like evidence-based practices, right? Like, I'm a researcher and I believe in, the way of the power of research and, the importance of finding evidence to support the things that we do within the classroom. That's super important, absolutely. However, an evidence-based practice, first and foremost, is only as good as the person who's implementing it, right? I can take a practice that has exorbitant amounts of evidence to support its use, but I can implement it in a not very well way. And, it's not going to be effective, even though research shows that there's this evidence to support it. If I'm not implementing it effectively, then it's probably not going to have the same outcomes that we're reading about within research.
And would some of that be asking the student, is this teaching practice helping or not? Is
Absolutely.
that almost setting a foundation for the learning? So if I know there's an evidence-based practice, can I set up in a way that's going to be accessible and engaging for the student? Would that be part of that?
Absolutely. And I think that's sort of
Mm.
where we get this cross between culturally responsive instruction and evidence-based instruction for students with special needs, right? So we've got a whole slew of evidence-based practices that are effective for students with disabilities across the range of different disability categories. But we still need to be attuned to who those individual students with disabilities are. Where do they come from? What are their backgrounds? What are their interests? What's going to keep them engaged and motivated to learn? Because, I could ask them a billion opportunities, I can provide a billion opportunities to respond. But if not a single one of those questions that I'm asking is something that is intriguing them, chances of them participating in that opportunity to respond are slim to none, right?
So true. So true. Yeah. So all of that was it was very interesting. Thank you so much for all of that. I'm wondering, this is the part of the podcast interview where it's very open. Do you have any upcoming publications, writing, any plugs you want to put in there?
Sure, yeah. I've got one piece that I had developed for practitioners, and um, that is focused on basically using some type of slide format, whether Google Slides, PowerPoint, so on and so forth, um, to create explicit and culturally responsive vocabulary lessons for your content area classes. That was in teaching exceptional children as of last year. And I also have a companion piece that goes along with that. That's going to be coming out in a um, special issue focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion within
Mhm.
the Journal of Special Education Technology. And that is, I call it a companion piece because the student materials that were used within this empirical study are what I describe in that practitioner piece. So
Mhm.
basically, the practitioner piece provides you guidance on how to make those slides for your own classroom, and the empirical piece provides some evidence to support their use.
Okay. Well, I can get a link to that. I could put it in the show notes.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.